Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today are two regulars on the Embargoed podcast. First, Dr. Tobias Ackerman from the law firm of BLOMSTEIN, who is coming to us live from Washington, D.C. Welcome back to the podcast, Tobias.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for having me.
And also a regular guest on the podcast is Melissa Burgess from our own shop in Miller and Chevalier in Washington, D.C. Welcome back to the pod.
Thanks, Tim. Glad to be back.
All right. Well, today on Embargoed, we are going to talk about a trade nerd topic, one that we don't talk about a lot. It's not going to be sanctions. It's not going to be export controls. It is going to be foreign direct investment. And in the United States, we have the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, better known to trade nerds as CFIUS. And what we wanted to talk to Dr. Ackerman today about is the foreign direct investment regime in Germany and do a little bit of a compare and contrast of those two things. So why don't you start a little bit by telling us, Tobias, about the foreign direct investment regime in Germany, and then we'll flip over to Melissa to contrast that a little bit with the regime in the United States.
Sure, Tim. Happy to start with that. So the FDI regime, the screening regime in Germany is actually not that young. It's over 20 years old. It was first introduced in 2004. But in the beginning, it was very limited in scope. So it only applied to acquisitions of producers of military goods and certain encryption systems. And only step by step it was expanded. In 2009, especially, it was broadened to introduce a cross-sectoral assessment. And it's actually my understanding that the US laws served as kind of a model for that. So it was drafted with the US example in mind. And it permitted the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs, so that is the competent authority. And I think it's easier if I speak about the ministry and not refer to the full title, which also shifted through the years. Sometimes it was Economic Affairs and Energy, then it was Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and now we're back to Energy. But I just leave it at Ministry. So these reforms permitted the ministry then to assess foreign investments and their threat to public order and security more broadly. And more recently, there were several reforms, several further extensions of FDI screening, introduction of reporting obligations, and the shift to from like classic traditional defense topics to additional sectors like media, high tech. Think about AI, semiconductors, quantum technology, stuff like that. And then in 2019. There was a new instrument adopted at the EU level. So as you know, the Germany is part of the EU, and many areas of law are harmonized through the EU, either because there are directly applicable laws at the EU level, or we have certain directives that give kind of a framework that member states need to implement. And at the EU, or when it comes to FDI screening, they chose to at first do a little bit of a slow approach, I would say, to the topic. So in 2019, it was not so much the adoption of binding rules on member states, but rather hey, member states, maybe you want to look at the FDI screening. Take a look at the countries, the member states that already have a screening framework, just like Germany. And maybe you want to adopt something similar. And since 2019, indeed, most EU member states have introduced some sort of a screening mechanism, although the details vary quite heavily so. So it's good that we want to focus here on German law, because it would be complicated and be beyond my expertise to talk about over 20 different laws. So let's stick to Germany.
We need a lot more time too, I think.
Yes, I think we could do a lot. I love talking about that. So let's focus on Germany, and maybe to roughly point out the procedure, and I'm sure we want to jump into a little more of the details. We kind of have a two-tier approach. So the one type of FDI assessment is done with respect to certain sectors that are closely linked to defense interests, the sector-specific assessment. Here you have mandatory filing obligations, and you have the particularity that it does not apply, that it always applies as soon as we have a foreign investor. Whereas in the second tier, the cross-sectoral examination or assessment, that only applies in case of a non-EU investor. And here you can also have filing obligations, depending again on the sector, which is a bit weird because we're actually talking about the cross-sectoral examination, but still the sector of the company that is to be bought still plays a very large role. If the ministry finds that such a deal might involve concerns from a national security or public order perspective, it can introduce or open investigations. And if it indeed has concerns, it can either take restricting measures, or as a last resort, it can also prohibit the transaction.
Interesting. All right. Well, I have some questions about it, but I'm going to hold them and flip it over to Melissa before we start kind of walking through the particulars of the German FDI regime. Let's talk a little bit about CFIUS and how it's evolved over the years, since it appears that CFIUS was a model for the German system.
Yep. And I definitely just learned something. I didn't realize the German system was older than the EU regulations. So CFIUS is just a little bit older. It actually celebrated its 50th birthday this past May. Started out as a creature of executive order. Yes, happy birthday, CFIUS. Started as a creature of executive order and had a kind of information gathering reporting function. It had the ability to sort of review transactions, but nothing like today. Apparently, in its first 5 years, it was so very active, it met a total of 10 times over those first 5 years. And when it did
probably
start looking...
a slow week for CFIUS.
Yeah, probably. Probably a slow day for CFIUS most of the time. But when it did start looking into transactions in the early 80s, it was mostly at the request of the Department of Defense. And as an interesting data point to more recent events,
just to butt in here quickly, we changed the names of our agencies as well, Tobias. So that's the Department of War you're talking about now, Melissa.
I stand corrected. CFIUS, however, has not changed its name, surprisingly, in the last 50 years. Yet. However, the constituent agencies may have, and they come and go, mostly come. But interestingly, one of the first, if not the first transaction that got a good close look by CFIUS at then DOD's request, was a Japanese firm seeking to acquire a U.S. specialty steel producer. What is old is new again. And apparently that transaction fell through because DOD, so it appears, I have not read every source document that is available, and of course most of it's probably classified, because DOD's reaction was to then classify some of the metals produced by the firm, so the potential Japanese investor withdrew. So that was kind of early CFIUS mitigation. But it was about 13 years after CFIUS first came to be that it was codified by Congress in the what's known as the Exxon-Florio Amendment. And that gave CFIUS more power. Interesting data point that I learned recently is apparently President Reagan actually vetoed the first version of this. largely at the insistence of Treasury, because Treasury was not happy. It thought it was about to lose some turf to commerce, and it wanted to make sure it stayed as the chair. But also, interestingly and very important for that compare-contrast piece is, at the time they were debating, well, should CFIUS review extend to, or should it be focused on national security, or should it look at national security plus essential commerce? And Treasury finally came on board with the idea of having CFIUS codified into statute when essential commerce was bid goodbye. So early on, it had the authority to investigate mergers, acquisitions, and takeovers. So a fairly limited pool of transactions. That changed dramatically with FIRMA back in 2018, where CFIUS now has jurisdiction over non-controlling investments or covered investments. And a bit like the German version, but with many differences in the details. We have both mandatory and voluntary filings. And of course, the grand debate when you are transaction parties of, well, if it's voluntary, but how voluntary really is it, given the area of interest. CFIUS can look far beyond military interests. Of course, that still remains kind of one of the chief, if not the chief area of interest it looks at, but especially in recent years, extending to things like sensitive personal data has been a major portion of what it looks at. And I think maybe one more quick point before we get a little more into compare and contrast is, CFIUS can deny a transaction, but before it gets there, it has to assess whether the national security risk can be mitigated. If the risk can be mitigated, the first question is, do existing laws mitigate that risk? Export controls, DOD, the NISPOM, and classified information restrictions, and the whole foreign ownership control and influence regime available under the NISPOM. But if there aren't existing laws to mitigate the risk identified, that's where CFIUS has the most authority to act.
Right. So it's just does the law have ways of mitigating this? So, for example, with respect to personal data, are there personal data laws that will protect against the risk that we're worried about? And if not, which often in the foreign investment context, there's really not, because we don't have any sort of global data protection regime here in the U.S., except for the recent DOJ regs that came out at the end of I think at the beginning of the year. Then CFIUS can come in, impose its own kind of custom-tailored mitigation to the particular transaction. So, Tobias, I do want to turn back to Germany, because Melissa kind of set up the U.S. regime in some detail, and I want to hear about some differences. I mean, the first one is, it sounds like there's some form of EU regime, although it might be as little as please member states create your own foreign direct investment review. Here, in the U.S., we basically have a federal regime, but we don't have any sort of state CFIUS as well. And so can you kind of tell me how strict the EU CFIUS or foreign direct investment review is, and then compare and contrast that with what goes on, at least in Germany as an example member state?
So the EU regulation so far, and I'm sure we'll have maybe time later to talk about the reform that is currently being debated. But so far, the regulation only sets out very limited criteria. It says, for example, member states that have an FDI screening regime have to provide for certain deadlines. They may view certain factors as relevant for their assessment. For example, whether they touch upon critical infrastructure and stuff like that. But there are no hard obligations for member states that they need to implement. That said, the German law was amended after the implementation of the regulation. And what was perhaps most important is that the cross-sectoral examination now not only takes into account German interests, but also interests of other EU member states. So, in theory, Germany could prohibit a transaction if it fears that the transaction could endanger the national security interests of, for example, France. So this is something that was introduced due to the regulation. And another thing is that there are certain projects on the EU level. They also relate to critical infrastructure, for example, energy supply, food supply, also like space programs and satellite navigation, something like that. These programs are also a factor, and governments that have these screening laws usually, and that's true at least for Germany, they have the power to restrict or prohibit an acquisition based on their potential impact on these EU projects.
Interesting. So it's basically, it's not national security, it's basically EU security, multinational security writ large, that the member states are essentially authorized to consider, or at least Germany is authorized to consider.
That's exactly right, yes.
Okay. So just kind of if we want to do a rough ballpark comparison, and I won't hold you to the numbers, but how many of the EU states, just roughly, have regimes that are similar to Germany's, which it looks like you take into account national security and deciding on particular foreign investments. You're looking at investments by sector and how critical they are to the national security. There is a review that roughly looks like the CFIUS review, taking into account that the differences between U.S. national security and EU national security. About how many EU states have that sort of kind of CFIUS type regime?
So, as far as I know, only 2 member states don't have it yet. So, 25 member states have some sort of screening regime. And one of the big changes that the potential reform of the regulation will bring is that the EU will make using FDI screening mandatory. So eventually it looks like it will come also in the other 2 remaining states. But as I said, without the reformed regulation, there are still there are very many distinctions between like the thresholds, the sectors that are considered. I would say Germany has a quite restrictive policy here, or at least the potential for a restrictive policy, because the provisions in the German laws are quite broad, and they give power to the ministry to review a whole lot of acquisitions.
Got it. And let's name some names. So who are the 2 holdouts?
Oh, now you caught me off guard. I would actually have to look that up.
All right. I didn't mean to call you out on that, but I wanted to do maybe a name and shame. But we'll hold off on that. All right. So in our direct investment regime, there are certain types of transactions that it's mandatory now to notify CFIUS about. So it's basically certain types of transactions that involve critical technology, critical infrastructure, or data, certain types of identifying personal data. Are there any mandatory transactions, mandatory disclosures under the German foreign direct investment scheme? Do you have kind of this mandatory voluntary?
We do. So we have mandatory filing obligations both under the sector-specific regime and under the cross-sector regime. And then it depends very much on how many voting rights are required. That is what the German law uses as a threshold. And if you are above this threshold, then you have to file. if you're below the threshold, or if the company does not fall within the sectors that are relevant, then you have a voluntary filing, just basically to make sure that the ministry will not come after up to 5 years, actually, after the signing of the deal, and look into the assessment, into the acquisition.
So that sounds like ours. Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
Well, that's a kind of big distinction, though. Only 5 years after, so they're time limited, and how. I'm sure there are many parties in the U.S. who wish CFIUS had that kind of statute of limitations, but right now they kind of have.
Off the top of my
head. They can look back. History is long, and they can look at it. Maybe not pre 1975, but.
But the unwinding is the only. It sounds like there's an unwind possibility, which is, I assume, in the German system, like our system, the incentive to voluntarily disclose is that if you don't disclose, you have this threat of unwinding. In Germany for 5 years, in the U.S. forever, pretty much, that there is this threat, and so that's the incentive. You mentioned voting rights, so I assume that the voting rights that would be transferred or that you would be acquiring through the investment are less than full control. In the U.S., we used to have only control triggered CFIUS jurisdiction. Now it sounds very similar, where if you get certain rights as part of the investment, including board seats and other types of rights to make decisions about the company, CFIUS review can be triggered and even mandatory without a change in control. Is Germany like that?
Yeah, that's right. So when we're talking about the more sensitive areas, like the defense sector, we are talking about only 10% of voting rights. If we're in the, let's say, less sensitive but still national security relevant sectors, and I'm talking here about, for example, medical sector, AI under certain conditions, autonomous driving, semiconductors, quantum computers, certain dual-use goods. So that is the less strict area, and here we are at 20% of a threshold. It's important to note that this does not only relate to direct voting rights, but also indirect acquisitions. And if you have a company that already has a smaller share, or already has a share, let's say, in voting rights, and acquires more, then reporting obligations can again apply if certain further thresholds are reached. So if you come from 20 and now you're having 25 or 40 or 50 or 75, depending on the sector, you have to go to the ministry again. And maybe one last point, the ministry also considers like issues of informal powers, informal control, so that you cannot circumvent these threshold requirements by, let's say, don't transferring voting rights, but still granting additional seats in a supervisory body, granting veto rights, and that can all taken into account and then still trigger filing obligations and the right to look at the acquisition on the side of the ministry.
Got it. And, what about data? And that's my last question, I promise, and I'm going to throw it over to Melissa to ask some of the good questions. So in the U.S., CFIUS, has, especially in the last 7 years or so, maybe 7 to 10 years, has really focused on, for the most part, China and a few other countries obtaining U.S. person data. That has been just a huge focus of CFIUS. It was a focus even before our kind of most recent statute related to CFIUS was passed. This FIRMA statute was passed in 2018 that formally told CFIUS it had to start looking at personal data issues. But even before that, we saw that CFIUS was, if there was a transaction that involved large quantities of personal data, even kind of medical data was where I first saw it. CFIUS became very interested in the transaction, and if it involved certain countries, would either prohibit it or impose a huge amount of mitigation. Is data a concern in the EU as well in terms of the foreign direct investment regime, or at least in terms of Germany?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the EU has certain data protection regimes in place, so they are very much concerned about that in principle. And whereas data transfers may not trigger a mandatory filing, it can certainly be taken into account by the ministry. So in practice, if we are aware that a lot of personal data of German and EU persons are involved, you would usually recommend a voluntary filing, just to make sure that it's not getting picked up. And we also have seen that the ministry can introduce restrictions based on data concerns. So, for example, give an obligation to keep EU personal data on EU servers and not transfer it to other countries.
Also a very common mitigation measure in the US. Keep it on the US server. Do not share. Do not pass go.
Right, what did I miss, Melissa?
Let us know if you're remotely interested in thinking about transferring it. Actually, one question I am interested in learning is kind of the more mechanics of the review process. So here in the US, we have a choice between two forms, either the declaration, which is kind of the short form, or the full notice, which is much longer. They both have different time periods tied to them. And, CFIUS has to react and reach a decision within those time periods, or in the case of the short form, the declaration. If it can't get to a decision or it's identified a national security threat, it can come back and say, no, we want you to file the long form. We can't close this transaction now. And then, of course, going through to the end, if it can't get through it in a notice or it needs to mitigate, then we have an investigation. And in the rare cases, but not improbable cases, ultimately there's a referral to the president. And this whole time in the U.S., this is a private process. The public doesn't know you're in front of CFIUS unless you tell them you're in front of CFIUS, unless and until you get to that point of a presidential denial. So how does that compare in Germany?
So I think the nature of the proceeding is also not public, unless, of course, it gets reported in the media. You usually don't hear about that before the ministry closes the assessment. There are exceptions where media coverage was quite present because it was just sensitive topics. So there were calls for intervene into this, and therefore it can be made public, but usually the administrative procedure is not public. And it starts with, or it depends a bit on whether you're in the area of mandatory filings or voluntary filings. If you have a voluntary filing, you formally apply for a certificate of non-objection. So you want the government to greenlight it expressly to be on the safe side, or at least let the deadlines expire. That would have the same legal effect. Formally, however, the procedures are similar. You have to fill out an Excel sheet and provide information on basically all the companies involved, like the target, of course, the acquirer, of course, but also the seller, and describe what kind of activities they are doing, what the purpose of the acquisition is, for example. And then you have this first step of the assessment, phase 1, that can either be triggered by a voluntary filing, by a mandatory filing, or it can also be triggered if the ministry learns about the deal in a different way, like from press reports or from press releases by the companies themselves, right? So in this case, they have 2 months to make this preliminary assessment and see if it's relevant at all. And if they say it is, then they open the formal investigation. They issue a formal decision, and then they have theoretically 4 months, starting after the date when they have all the necessary documents and information. But this 4-month period is usually longer because, first of all, as far as the ministry asks for additional information, the expiry of the deadline is stopped, and it only begins to expire further when the information is provided.
Well, that would be something. So when CFIUS is reviewing a transaction, we have 3 days to respond to any questions. Well, 2 days if you're in the short form version, 3 days in the long form. So it's always the minute you file, you have everyone. At any moment, we might get a set of questions, and we're just gonna have to go for it. No vacations, no disappearing while we're in front of CFIUS. It would be nice to have that clock stop.
Well, it stops on the side of the ministry, but the company may have an interest in not prolonging the process. So I think
Our
the
clock
pressure
never
is
stops.
on. Yes.
Though on that note, it sounds like there may be a little similarity. So when you submit to CFIUS, CFIUS doesn't have to accept your filing right away. So often, say with the declaration that's subject to a 30-day deadline from when it's accepted the filing, it might take a week or two beforehand and look at what you submitted and ask you some questions, and sometimes you even have a round or two of that. Now, I think there's definitely criticism levied against CFIUS that you're not really supposed to do that. The whole point is you have 30 days and that's it. But it can be strategic and buy itself a little extra time and ask those extra questions, which sometimes it's nice for the parties to know you're not on the clock yet to get those answers right. But when the parties were counting on a 30-day review and actually it's 15 plus days before that clock starts, that can really mess with the transaction timing.
The government has ways of extending its own deadlines, but they usually aren't as kind when it comes to us, has been my experience. Is that anything like that in Germany, Tobias? Or is the government always like, just take as much time as you need?
No, they would certainly chase you after it, but they don't have the pressure, right? If the company doesn't answer in time, it's their loss, basically, right? And in addition, the ministry can also unilaterally prolong the deadline if the deal is particularly difficult or involves defense interests. And what's quite interesting is that they can agree with the parties for another extension. So they can mutually agree upon multiple extensions of the deadlines. And the idea, of course, is to say, okay, we're not sure yet. Based on our initial review, we would maybe adopt or recommend restrictions or even prohibitions. But if you give us more time, then we can assess this in more detail. And in order to do so, please agree to the extension. And then most companies would likely agree.
Yeah, CFIUS doesn't quite have, well, they have one extraordinary extension opportunity for 15 days, which from their most recent annual report, they exercised twice last year. So it is comparatively extraordinary. But what they most frequently do is suggest to the parties that they should withdraw and refile the notice, and then that clock starts over on day one, which thankfully, with technology, the withdraw refile can be almost limited to a push of the button on their end as opposed to starting everything over. Unless, of course, part of the problem is the structure of the transaction or something where really the parties are doing the withdrawal refile so that they have time to off the clock to renegotiate some aspect of the deal, how they're going to structure it, what needs spun out, or whatever they might do before they then go back on the clock.
So update, I think I found the EU stragglers. So we are going to name names. So at least as best I can tell, Cyprus and Croatia still do not have foreign direct investment schemes, although within the past 6 months, the list was 5. So you also had Greece, Ireland, and Bulgaria. Bulgaria apparently still has kind of no real system, but it does have a law, but it doesn't have an implementing measure for the law. So Bulgaria is kind of in this rough space where it's adopted what it's supposed to adopt, but it hasn't adopted the mechanism to do anything about it. But so news flash to any of our listeners: if you're thinking of investing in a European country and you may, for whatever reason, have a tough time getting past a foreign direct investment review committee, Cyprus and Croatia would be the places that you would want to go to make your investments. I hope I'm not giving away any secrets.
However, one of the issues, or not necessarily issues, but points to be aware of is, for instance, if you have a multinational with operations in, say, Germany and France and Ireland, it's not that you get to go, or correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is you don't just get to go to one and say, okay, your headquarters is in Germany, so that's what we're going to worry about. No, you actually may have to go to all of the above, in addition to CFIUS, if there's a U.S. subsidiary.
Yeah, that's right, and that is also something that this regulation tries to tackle, because it provides for a coordination mechanism between the member states and the European Commission. So there is supposed to be like an exchange of information and hopefully a streamlining of the whole process. In practice, however, that does not work perfectly, and that's why the reform of the regulation also tries to strengthen this coordination.
Could you imagine, we'd have to go to Alabama CFIUS and Rhode Island CFIUS and Montana CFIUS? There would be quite a different regime. I mean, coordination would probably be good.
Well, the one area where that's a little more common in the U.S. is with real estate and agricultural land right now, which has been a hot issue. It's currently a hot issue in Congress, though it kind of has been for a few years now, just because CFIUS only has limited jurisdiction over transactions that are purely real estate transactions, no business involved. And the CFIUS jurisdiction is essentially geographically limited to activities within certain distances of sensitive military sites. Then you get something like a few years ago, there was I believe it was a Chinese outfit trying to buy a bunch of land outside Grand Forks, North Dakota. There was an Air Force base in the area, but it wasn't on the list. And it eventually led to last year major revisions to the list of relevant military sites. But it kind of encouraged many states to start thinking about that aspect a bit more and coming up with their own state regimes as an interim fix, if you will. I guess it will be interesting to see if Congress does pass some of there's a Soil Act, and I believe it's called a Farm Act, and also a Protect Act, and a few other things that are pending right now that all take different approaches to some CFIUS jurisdiction over real estate. But depending on how they go, it'd be interesting to see if some states roll back or decide, you know what, the government's interests aren't the same as our state interests in, say, this land for this purpose.
Yeah, and I mean, it will be interesting to see if the states pull back, mostly because their interests are likely going to be economic interests as opposed to national security type interests. They might care about national security too, but the federal government is usually in a better position to assess that. But you mentioned some changes. So, Tobias, I hear there are some changes that are maybe afoot in the EU. Do you want to talk a little bit about those in terms of reforms or new measures that might be passed to, either improve or, depending upon your perspective, undermine EU foreign direct investment regimes?
Yeah. So there have been discussions in Germany to reform and streamline the whole process. Even they wanted to adopt a separate law on FDI screening, but that was under the previous administration, and the new one under Chancellor Merz does not seem to have the same priority. But that may also be related to the fact that, as I've already hinted at the EU level, there is currently a reform plan. So the 2019 regulation is under revision. And, we not only have the member states in the EU, but we also have the different organs of the European Union itself that are involved in these processes. So here we are currently at the stage of the so-called trialogue. That's a discussion basically between the Commission of the EU, the European Parliament, and the Council of the EU. The Council is the representation of all governments of the member states, and they are currently debating proposals for reform. And they are aligned on certain points. So, for example, what they want to do is make screening mandatory, also for Cyprus and Croatia.
Get them in line?
Yes, exactly. But other parts are yet unclear. So the European Parliament basically wants to broaden the scope, give more power also to the Commission, to the EU itself. And the Council, they are very much keen on keeping the flexibility and the discretion of the member states and how they want to implement the screening. So, for example, the European Parliament, they want to introduce new sectors that are where you have mandatory filing. For example, when it comes to media, when it comes to election infrastructure, also farming for the sake of food security. Whereas the Council wants to really stick to the hardcore national security issues like military, dual-use goods, and they want to have this flexibility for member states. Another thing is also whether they want to introduce reporting obligations for greenfield investment, which, by the way, in Germany is not the case. And here the Council also says, no, we want to have the member states decide this individually. So you get the gist what it's all about. And the same, maybe another point of discussion and debate is whether actually the Commission should have the power to investigate and prohibit even acquisitions, because currently it can only be done by the member states itself. And the European Parliament has a very far-reaching proposal. They say if EU interests are involved, or if member states point out their own security interests, that the Commission can overrule national decisions by a government, which is of course viewed very critically by the Council, and perhaps unsurprisingly did not make the draft of the Council. So we'll see how it will play out. I think it's expected that they will come to some kind of compromise maybe by the end of this year or starting next year. And then it would have to go through the whole legislative process and then be adopted. And usually then you have some time for member states to implement it. So that would take at least another 2 years. So it's a longer process. But I think the general idea of streamlining these different national laws and to introduce some coherence into requirements for filing, the deadlines and so on, that would be really great to have, especially if you have multi-jurisdictional dealings that are currently quite hard to streamline.
It sounds like you might have to do multiple filings if you're in multiple EU member states at this point, which
right
could be a lot. Could be up to 27, right? Well, maybe
exactly.
25. So why don't you tell us a little bit about changes that are coming in the U.S., or at least under consideration under the President's America First agenda?
Yes, so in late February, the President announced the America First investment policy, which is a bit broader than just CFIUS. It also looks at outbound investment questions, but specifically in relation to CFIUS, one of its proposals is essentially creating a fast track process where you can, particularly for frequent investors, you could become a quote unquote known investor. And while the details are still being hammered out, the broad concept would be CFIUS could basically get to know you and your structure and who's involved before that clock starts ticking on an actual transaction, which, from experience, that would be very handy. Maybe it would cut out those
global entry for investors.
Yeah. I'm sure there would have to be a mechanism so that when you actually submit CFIUS, or you'd have to tell CFIUS whether anything had changed since you went through that kind of known investor review. But I do think for, say, some of those, like for some startups and non-controlling investments, private equity, series funding, that could probably speed up a lot of transactions and help with timing, especially because so many of those transactions tend to be on very short fuses. They often need the money yesterday, so telling them you might have 2 months plus in front of CFIUS is generally not welcome news. Other things that are hinted at or addressed head on in that policy are, obviously, if you will, the China problem, and teasing out the balance of it's not we want to prohibit all investment whatsoever, but we definitely want to prohibit active and controlling investments. So there is some language in the policy about, well, if it's passive, maybe we'll still allow it. But if you have direct Chinese investment, indirect investment, essentially, if we can make sure there are no ties to that, then maybe we'll be much more welcoming. It's always hard, like throughout the history of CFIUS, the mantra has always been, we are open for business. We're not about trying to cut off foreign investment. But I think for those prospective investors that get run through the ringer, they might disagree.
But I think that, you could amend that now to say we're not trying to cut off all foreign investment, but if you're from particular countries, it's going to be really hard.
Yeah, and that's already the case. It's just kind of changed historically. At one point, Japan was kind of the high-risk investor, and for, I believe, many decades now, that's very much the opposite. But the president's statement and some of those bills pending in Congress are actually would create for the first time an actual prohibited investor, like prohibited country list. Like right now, most people assume, China's a no, or it's going to be really hard to get to yes. Same with Russia. But some of those would, for the first time, actually either explicitly call out countries or cross-tie to other definitions that essentially explicitly call out countries. Most of them unsurprising. Russia, China, Cuba, comprehensively sanctioned.
Iran. I'm not sure we're getting a lot of Iranian direct investment in the United States, but if this thing goes through, no more.
But it would, from a pure legal perspective, it would be a big change to the system to say some are just automatically prohibited. Or also that some countries are automatically subject to review as opposed to more the identity of everything about the transaction, the critical technology, whether it's a foreign government investor being that trigger. So we shall see how many of those. I mean, most of them are competing visions trying to get at something common. So we'll see how it turns out in the next year or so.
Well, we'll have to come back in another 6 months and see what's happening. So any final words, Tobias? I know last time you were here, you told us, you introduced the concept of the trade bazooka to us. Anything you want to import from Germany here? We're really enjoying having you here in the States. So we want to kind of hear whatever thoughts you've got on foreign direct investment or anything else.
Yeah, I mean, while there is the threat of a bazooka in FDI as well, namely the prohibition, it's really, I mean, it relates to what Melissa says. Also in Germany, it's not the intention of the government to prohibit investments as a rule, right? It should be the exception. And if you look at the statistics, I just looked at it again. So in 2024, for example, there were over 260 cases filed with the German ministry alone. And in only 8 cases, there was a restricting measure in that year. So it's really low. The highest was a couple of years ago with 11% of all deals where there were restrictions, and prohibitions are even less frequent. But interestingly, it's still, also because of the enforcement risks, it's still that many companies file, even voluntarily, and the US actually is the majority origin of foreign investors filing such reports. So hopefully it's interesting to US listeners
Yes.
what we've discussed today.
That is very interesting. I think our U.S. listeners better beware. If you're going to invest in Germany, you may need to go through the FDI review. Melissa, last word.
Last word. Well, one thing I learned today is it sounds like if you actually manufacture bazookas, you're going to be subject to mandatory filing in both countries.
Words to live by.
So.
All right, well,
watch out for the bazookas.
Thank you both for coming on Embargoed, and until next time.
Produced by Heartcast Media.